Go.
Okay, so this is an example of how we've used it quite traditionally and how we started the process. This is a piece of A-level work where the student has completed their essay, and then at the end of their essay we've written the SIR. So I filled in the strength and I filled in the improvement, and I've given them a banding, and their response was then to look over the comments that I've written in the essay, highlight a particular piece that they wanted to improve, and they've then gone away and rewritten it, which enables me, so this is their response, it enables me then to talk about whether I feel they've met their improvement and whether I feel they've actually strengthened the banding that they were in. So it gives us a really clear link to progress throughout a piece of work. Catherine has an example of how she's used it a bit differently.
So to begin with, when we use SIR, just like Joe's explained, the strength was something that a student had done particularly well, while an improvement was something that they needed to do in order to be moved on and to progress to the next level or the next band. From listening to other teachers, I know that teachers at school have found the response section of the marking scheme to be quite time-consuming. So what I've done here, instead of getting the student to respond immediately to the target that I've set, they've put a date, and the next time we worked on similar skills, they've gone on to action that target in their next piece of work, which works much better in terms of managing students' response.
Sometimes it can be quite nice as well to get them to write their improvement at the top and highlight it, which I know they've done here, but it can just keep them then on track and you can highlight and tick it off as you go along.
Yeah.
Another way then that I've used it quite similarly in a final piece of assessment is I've marked the students' work as we've gone through, and then I've circled the areas of strength that they've met, filled in the strength and the improvement, and then in the response, as it was the end of the unit, I got them to evaluate that particular unit. So rather than having to respond at that point because it was a final exam, they just look back on where they felt they had made progress throughout the unit.
With Year 11, I have, for this particular piece of work, I've gone through and I've marked with my comments in green and corrected different literacy errors and commented on what had been done and asked questions of the student in terms of things that I'd like them to develop more on. And then the student decided for themselves what they thought their strength was based on my comments, what they believed they needed to do to push themselves forward and achieve the next band, and then they've responded. So this particular student has done her response in a different colour, so it's really clear. So I've asked a question on form and she's made it very clear what her opinion of the form of that poem was.
I found as I was working through that it could be quite daunting for lower ability students to work with, and they found it quite hard to complete the response. So particularly usefully, because I had quite a small class, I started then to ask questions, and my improvement comment was something that was rounding up the questions that I'd had to ask, and then in the response they had to answer the questions as they went along, and I could immediately answer whether I felt they'd met that. But it just made it very, very clear for lower ability students where they needed to do the particular improvement, and they could answer it in the time, and they seemed to be able to find it much easier to answer questions in the moment.
A different example, here is a piece of work belonging to a Year 12 student, and on this particular occasion the student's work was peer assessed by somebody else in the class. Their peer told them something that they'd done well, set them at a target for improvement, and in the response, the student told their peer what they'd actually learnt from reading this piece of work. And then when the students got back together, they had a discussion, a dialogue about the piece of work. The student has also highlighted different parts of the work that they thought were particularly strong.
Something that we use quite a lot in English is success criteria. So we take the assessment objectives for an exam or a controlled assessment and break them down into the success criteria. And then what we've started to do with SIR is to get students to peer or self-assess a particular piece of work using the success criteria, and they need to highlight and annotate where they feel a student has met those particular areas. Then, if it's a peer assessment piece, for example, they'll fill in the strength, and then their partner needs to read through the comments that are written in the margin, set themselves an improvement, and then I fill in the response. So I look back over everything and I will say whether I agree with the comments that they have made themselves, whether there is something else that I feel that they need to continue to work on, continue to develop. And that's really helped with marking. It makes marking quite quick, but it also ensures that self and peer assessment is really valuable. They know that I'm going to look at what they've done, so they can't write brief comments. They need to explain the particular targets or areas of strength, and that's been a really useful way to encourage them to value self and peer assessment.
I think the point that Jo has just made about how much more valuable marking is because of CERT is really important. It definitely has encouraged students to engage much more closely with the comments that we've made. Here is another example. Before I took this piece of work in and marked it, the student themselves self-assessed, and you can see that they've used a highlighter to highlight different things that were done well. As well as this, they've annotated for me the different success criteria within the piece of work, and then I've gone on to comment on their own assessment. So here I can quite clearly see that the student has understood the assessment criteria. I didn't need to go on to do another S and I could have just written R here, which I often do in the students' books, and respond to the comments that they've made themselves.